There's nowhere where you're actually taught how to manage your money, but we're just kind of expected to know.
A lot of people have a lot of, shame and guilt when it comes to money because they can't stick to something and they just constantly feel like a failure.
I think money in some ways kind of gets tied in with how well you're doing, right? Like, are you successful in life?
You have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, especially if you're trying to get out of a bad financial situation. Like, it's going to take some change.
When money gets talked about within a relationship and it's a conflict, it's rarely just about the money.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Lauren and I are back for our weekly episode where we talk all things money, and we have a special one today. We are joined by Dr. Shereen Mohsen. She is a licensed clinical psychologist based out of California, the owner of Relucent Psychology Group, and a super fit mom of two. Shereen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Super pumped.
Yeah, absolutely. Given your experience as a psychologist, we thought today would really be the perfect opportunity to talk about this connection that Lauren and I see all the time, which is between mental health and personal finance. But, before we dive into all the fun stuff we have planned for today, we would love to hear a little bit more about your background and kind of what got you into the field of mental health.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of crazy for me to even acknowledge and say out loud that I've been in the mental health space for over 15 years, which just feels crazy. But yeah, what I feel like when I say that, what it does kind of bring to mind is like just how passionate I am about the field. And I've always been passionate about the field pretty much since I was a kid. I've always just been curious about people. And then as I've gotten older, got curious about like, why do people do the things that they do? Why do we feel what we feel? And so when it got to kind of picking out what I was going to do for my profession, it just felt like a perfect fit. And then even just going on my own mental health journey, it just solidified like, yeah, okay, this is it for me. This is what I'm super curious about and passionate about. And that fortunately, like as I've been into it over 15 years, it just gets more, I get more and more intrigued about all the new things going on and new things that are happening for us in society and the world. And so I've been working as a practicing psychologist and have worked in a lot of different fields, but different areas. But now I've been settled into my business. And so I think this topic of finance totally is very like front and center of my world too, being a business owner. And not like, I don't have the background of being a business owner. So, I'm like a trained therapist, trained psychologist. So I think even just talking about finances in the realm of mental health is also just big for a person who has to be in touch with numbers, but it's also not my jam,
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm curious, being a psychologist is one thing, but then owning your practice is a completely different thing. What kind of led from you, loving the profession to wanting to own your own business in it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think when I was in school, I think I always kind of knew I wanted to do my own thing. And it's very common for therapists to start their own private practice, but it isn't that common to start their own group practice. And so I think I always knew I wanted to be in my own practice. I think I also kind of on some level knew I didn't want to have a boss. So I think that was also part of it. I just wanted to do my own thing, call the shots. And then once I started my own practice, it was really my partner at the time who was like, you should do this. Like this is, you've got, I was supervising and I was doing some mentoring and I was really into that. And so I think, and he has a finance background. And so he was really the one who was giving me that confidence of like, I can help you with the numbers. I can help you with the finances. You figure out the clinical stuff. And then it just went rolling from there. And so, yeah, and I always kind of knew that I wanted to be in something where I could wear multiple hats. And I think being a business owner is exactly that. Like I'm always wearing multiple hats. Like for 1 hour of my day, I'm a therapist. For the next 3 hours of my day, I'm a business owner. And then for the next 2 hours of my day, I'm a supervisor and a clinical supervisor. So that kind of variety I've always been into. So yeah, but it's definitely been a huge learning curve to say the least.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I business owner as well. And so I totally get it. But the desire to want to wear multiple hats is almost a little freeing. But kind of diving into what we have for today, Lauren and I what we talk about on the show has so much to do with getting out of debt, or putting the right kind of spending behavior in place, or really just trying to improve your financial situation. But the reason we were so excited to have you on is because so much of what we talk about as well has to do with the mental side of managing your finances, and in particular, and we're really curious to hear if this is something you've noticed as well. But we've come across this idea so many times where people seem to be stuck in this cycle of what I like to call the cycle of negative reinforcement, where, and just to give you an example, let's say someone is dealing with a lot of stress, and that might be from something in their personal life, their professional life, or even in their financial life, but that usually causes them to turn away from their finances, or turn away from managing the financial responsibilities in their life. And of course, that makes the situation worse. It adds to the stress, and they're kind of just stuck in this cycle where it just kind of repeats itself until eventually something breaks. And since you're kind of on the other side of that conversation in the mental health space, is that something that you've seen as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because I think when I think about avoiding, and they know it's an issue, but they don't want to address it. Avoidance, just generally, is something that relieves like distress for us in the moment, right? Like we tend to want to avoid things that are hard for us. And so that's actually kind of like a self-preservation technique that we have of like, oh, this is difficult. This is giving me bad feelings. I want to move away from it. And that's actually in theory not a bad thing, right? But when it's done excessively, and when it's done to the point where then we're just completely negligent of this issue that we do need to pay attention to, that's when it starts to actually, in the long run, create more problems than good. So I think probably why we see it so much, and I for sure see it in my practice with clients, is in the moment when we're avoiding, it feels good. We're like, oh, okay, good. I don't have to deal with that. I'm just not going to think about it. So it actually helps us in the moment, but in the long run, it actually just ends up bringing up more guilt, more, stress, more shame. And then I think that's the cycle that people get into of they're avoiding, and then that's reinforcing. So they want to keep avoiding, but then eventually they realize, oh crap, this is actually making things worse. And then sometimes that will lead to more avoidance until they can no longer avoid it anymore. Right. Eventually they, maybe things crash and they're like, crap, okay, I'm totally out of money. I have to address this. But that happens in a bunch of different areas in our life, right? This idea of avoiding for like self-preservation of like, this is just going to help me in the moment, but then in the long run, it doesn't. And it's tough when it is finances because you can only avoid it for so long. Yeah.
And I love that you kind of talk about it like a defense mechanism, because on one hand, if you're avoiding the bad things in life that are causing you stress, that's great. That's probably what you should be doing. But then if you're avoiding the things that you do need to handle that are causing you stress, like it's such a fine line to walk, because you got to be able to distinguish what are the things that I should be avoiding versus I shouldn't be avoiding, even though both of those areas might be causing me stress.
Yeah. And like, how much am I avoiding? Right. So like if I have like a big meeting at work, but I have this financial stress, maybe avoiding your financial stress in that moment when you have to prep for your work meeting is good. Right. That's going to help you. But then when you're living your day-to-day life and you're continuing to avoid it and you're never coming back to it to try to address it, that's when it really becomes an issue.
Yeah.
So that's where I think it gets dicey, because sometimes, it can be helpful in certain moments, but then in the long run, it just then turns into us feeling guilty, we feel bad about ourselves. We feel like then like lack of confidence can come in. That's, all kinds of really tough stuff can come up.
Now, why do you think people kind of fall into that, again, if it's with things that they know they should be handling, why do you think people kind of fall into that trap over and over, even though they probably have evidence from how their life has been going that it only makes the situation worse? Why do you think they kind of get stuck in that?
I think in some ways it's habitual. It just becomes habit. I think the other potential is they don't know any other way.
Yeah.
Right. And so they don't know any other way. They haven't had mentorship. They haven't had somebody kind of guide them in how to address it differently. And so they're stuck in the cycle and they don't know how to get out of it. I think also the reality is, if you're going to face something that you're avoiding, what that does require is your ability to tolerate uncomfortable feelings. You know what I mean? Because if
Yeah.
you're going to eventually face the thing that you're avoiding, it's going to bring up really uncomfortable feelings. It's going to bring up stress. It maybe bring up panic. It may bring up, right? And so in order to not avoid, you actually have to have the tools, like the emotional regulation tools, to be able to say, okay, I'm going to face this really stressful situation so that I can address it. And that is unless you're working with someone to help you do that, or you're doing a lot of your own work, to try to face those really uncomfortable feelings, it's tough. So then people will just stay in that cycle.
Yeah.
Does that make
And
sense? It's
100%.
also the other, right? The other piece I was going to say is, you know, they'll totally find other ways to continue to distract themselves. So they'll think like, oh, you know what I mean? Like we can be pretty sophisticated people, right? So it's like, well, I'm not really going to fully address my financial situation, but instead I'm just going to plan this trip and like maybe potentially spend all this money, but I'm not really going to think about it, and it's going to be fine, and I'll deal with it later. And they're kind of just kicking the can. What is that expression?
Yeah, kicking the can down the road, 100%.
Exactly. So then you can kind of play these games with yourself of like, I'm not totally avoiding it. I'm going to address it next month after this big thing at work is over, So I think that also can come into it.
Yeah. And Lauren, you say this all the time, like you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And like, that's true in so many areas of your life, whether it's in your personal life, your relationships, your fitness even, but like in your finances as well, especially if you're trying to get out of a bad financial situation. Like it's going to take some change. It's going to take you being uncomfortable, having to kind of face that discomfort and say, you know what, this is what I need to do though.
Exactly. And sometimes that means in order for a person to be able to sit with that discomfort, maybe they're scared to do that alone. So sometimes they need somebody, like a trusted person near them, to kind of guide them through it. And if you don't have that,
yeah,
then it just kind of feels like you're on this island, and so maybe in those moments, it is just better to continue to avoid because you don't have the tools to kind of help you through that. And I think the other thing too is just because it's an issue doesn't necessarily ignite like motivation to change. For example, and you mentioned fitness. That's a perfect example. Like people know exercise is healthy for them, right? Like people know that they need to exercise and drink more water and all that stuff. But insight doesn't necessarily equal change and action, And so we want to think like, oh, as long as I know these things, then yeah, I'll probably implement it. But I think our emotions sometimes can get the best of us, and that doesn't necessarily happen that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this, you sort of talked about how we know we should be doing what we should be doing. But I think, Nick and I talk about this all the time about how, money is relatively simple, right? Like you make this much per month, here's your bills. Why do people have so much credit card debt? If we know exactly what we're bringing in each month, what our bills are, like, why can't we, figure that out? So it's different than actually having the knowledge and actually sticking to it. So from your experience, and maybe we touched on this a little bit, but, why is it so difficult for people to follow through on the things that they should be doing, whether it's for your health, the money stuff, whatever it is, why is that so hard to do when it's actually like pretty straightforward if you think about it?
Totally. Yeah. It's a great question. I think, I can think of a bunch of reasons. The first reason that comes to my mind is temptation, social pressures. Right? Like, what you mean you're not going to get that extra drink? You're not going to go on this trip with us? Like, you're not, come on, you got to come, even if it's totally out of your budget, So I think there's that piece. I think also, especially in our society here, sometimes image and what we are wearing and what we're buying, what kind of car we're driving can give us a certain level of status and simple, right? And and if you're a person who's struggling with, say, confidence or like not feeling totally worthy of things, you may buy things that are way out of your budget to make yourself feel better, right? So that's definitely something that we see. I think also people who are perfectionists, I think, or have like perfectionistic tendencies, when they know that this is one area that they really struggle with, like they just don't even want to look at it. They don't even want to address it. Like if I can't get it 100% right, then I just don't even want to, right? Like I don't even want to like deal with it. I think that can come up. Also, like this kind of all or nothing thinking, I think can
Mm,
also come into play of like, well, if I'm not like saving X amount each month, then F it. Like
yeah.
I'm just not going to do anything. You know what I mean? Like, well, but I have to have my Starbucks every morning. So, and I know I shouldn't. So if I'm not willing to give that up, then I might as well not even pay attention to my finances. Do you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
sometimes there is this all or nothing thinking that I think can also hold us back. Um, and then I also think, honestly, like one piece that's super important here is like what we grew up with and what we're used to seeing how money is handled in our families and how we grew up. I think that also plays into it quite a bit too. Like I think at some point this probably will come up, but it's like, money is one of the number one things couples fight about. And
Yeah.
kids, when kids are in the house, like they hear that, right? Like, so I for sure heard my parents complaining and, fighting about money. Like it's just a super common thing. And that absolutely influences your own spending, whether it's you're spending too much or you're really rigid with your spending and don't want to spend anything, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And I like what you said about, social pressure. I think, and Nick and I have talked about this many times, but I think it's increased with social media and being able to show your entire life and,
Totally.
the constant the constant social pressure from that, but also like the comparison being like, well, if that person has that, then I need this, like I need to look like this, and not knowing other people's financial situations. Are they, trust fund kids, or are they deeply in debt doing this? You know what I mean? So, and it's kind of like almost an entitlement game as well. You know what I mean? Like that
Yep.
kind of thing pops up all the time. Back in the 90s, we didn't, have to really worry about that. But now it's like you're seeing so many different things. And I'll say TikTok shop has even become so crazy, is like I'm scrolling through the app and it's constantly selling me things. And I will say I do give into it from time to time. So so we
Yeah.
constantly have like these pressures to to buy things that we probably can't afford because we're being promised that it'll make us happier, also something you mentioned there. But yeah, something else you touched on, I think how we grow up with money really impacts like our, I think there's some sort of statistic, maybe, I'm not sure, but I saw something like by the time you're 7, like your money sort of habits or, your environment around money is sort of set, like where you're kind of at with that. And it does sort of ring true for me because I feel like I was raised by a single mom and who was pretty strict with our finances just because she had to be. And I feel like for me, I'm mostly like her. But it's funny because my sister is more like my dad because she had him for a lot longer. She's 8 years older than me, so they were together a little bit longer. So we're like completely different, but we grew up in like the same house. We kind of like mock each of our parents, but yeah, I think that definitely starts like super early. So if you want to touch on any more of that, I love that stuff because I think that's where all of this really starts.
Yeah, no, oh, it absolutely does. And I think we can't talk about money and conflicts with money, especially within
Yep.
relationships or within ourselves, without considering our family of origin and where we came
Hmm.
from, because that's like the first introduction that we get to money and
Yeah.
how, and that's the first time we're seeing how people like our loved ones, our parents are handling money. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that that's a big one. Like, for example, like my parents, they argued about money all the time, all the time. And in my relationships, if anybody is ever going to question what I'm spending, I'm like, wait, I feel like this is my mom and dad all over again. You know what I mean? And so, I mean, because that was very much their dynamic of like my dad being like, what did you spend? Why did you spend $100 on this? That, my mom defending herself. So instantly I noticed getting triggered in that moment. Like whenever I'd be questioned, well, why did you spend this money, this much money on this? And it was so obvious to me that I was like, oh, there we go. That's totally my parents. And so you have to like consider that, of like how that's impacting you and your spending habits and even your own judgments on other people's spending habits.
It's interesting that you say that because I feel like when you grow up seeing a certain behavior modeled by your parents, you either follow that like in line step for step, or you're like the complete opposite of that. And like a good example that I have is like, let's say your parents were like, money was, you were always strapped for cash. Like your parents were always strapped for cash. And so sometimes that can lead to people to develop like a a bad behavior with their money, or like a bad relationship with their money, maybe that means that they'll become like chronic savers where they save way more than they should be saving, and that negatively impacts their life. But then on the other hand, it might also mean that they start to live like a frugal life, but a frugal in a good way that benefits what they're doing. Is there like, I don't know what's going on there, to where people either go directly in line with what they see being modeled, or they go the complete opposite way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really varies because, like, for example, if you were a kid who grew up where your parents just didn't want to spend money on anything, and like you have holes in your shoes and you're going to school, and like, you don't have the clothes that everybody else has, like there can be almost like something somewhat kind of traumatic about that. If like you aren't really like being totally taken care of in the way that you need. And so sometimes then as we get older, our response to money and how we spend our money is actually in a way a bit of a trauma response. Like it's in reaction to like the really negative experiences you had as a kid, right? And that might be spending too much because you didn't get enough as a kid. Or it may be, oh, I was so used to not getting enough as a kid that like I need to make sure that I hold on to everything. And that can sometimes lead to hoarding, which is a whole other thing. But like that, so it can lead to, so it, in terms of like how it kind of determines one way or the other, it's kind of I think it just depends on the person and their personality style and what they grew up seeing and how they've chosen to cope with the struggles that they went through as a kid. Some people will cope by like in excess and do too much, where others will cope by holding back and like not spending anything. And I think usually it just depends on the person.
Mm.
Yeah.
Earlier, you had mentioned you were talking about like this all or nothing mindset or behavior, and I feel like I see that all the time. For example, like let's say you're doing good, you packed your lunch, you come to work, and then your coworkers are like, "Hey, do you want to order out? Like we're all going to do it." And it kind of ties into that social pressure a little bit as well, where you're like, "Okay, I'm going to just give into that." But afterwards, the feeling of guilt, feeling like you let yourself down, like you're like, "Okay, well today's a waste. Then I may as well as just allow that to snowball into the rest of the day." And then that might snowball into the rest of the week. And before you know it, you're so off base from that good intention that you set out. Like, I think that's so interesting to see, like when those sorts of mindsets start to like compound with each other, like the all or nothing, the social pressure, just having to give in to stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think in a way it can be really difficult for people to really set certain goals for themselves of like, okay, I'm not going to eat lunch out. That's it. Like, I'm not going to eat lunch out. But then when they get the temptation and they give into it, they feel so guilty about it. They feel so bad about it that I think that those feelings are then what leads them to be like, okay, forget it. I'm just going to give in to all of my temptations and go spend money on X, Y, and Z. And I think that's why, again, Nick, when you first reached out to me, like that's why I think money and mental health are so intertwined, because emotions are very, very deeply connected to it.
Yeah.
That if we don't really make space to really recognize what kind of feelings are coming up for us, like in that moment, in that scenario, when that person decided to say, okay, I'm just going to go have lunch. If they gave themselves space, say later that afternoon, to be like, man, I feel really guilty about that. Man, I shouldn't have done that. But you know what? I did it. It's okay. It was like $20. All right. The rest of the day, I'm really going to try. And like they had compassion for themselves. They recognized they were feeling bad, but they kind of talked themselves through it. That's emotion regulation, right? Like that's an example of being able to regulate a bad emotion that they had, which was guilt. And then through compassion, self-compassion, they talked themselves through it and said, okay, it's fine. Like it's okay that you got this lunch. You still can stay on track with your goals, and you're going to continue to do that. If that person did that, they probably would be able to continue with their goals. But majority of people don't, right? Because I think that, as a society, we don't really like to make space for painful feelings. Right? Like painful feelings of guilt, like we just want to shove it away and try to find some other way of coping. And I think that the more that we can just make space for being like, man, I don't feel good about that. And just acknowledge that and have some self-awareness and then have some self-compassion with it, a lot of really good change can come from that.
It's interesting because I noticed this a few years ago that I was kind of leaning towards that all or nothing mentality, where like if I was trying to trying to like change a behavior or set a new habit, like if I didn't follow through with it, like that day, I was like, okay, today is a wash. Like I might like, it's okay if the rest of the day doesn't go bad because it already started off bad. What really helped for me is someone had mentioned this, but like thinking of your day like in quarters, like almost like a basketball game. Like, all right, the first quarter did not go well. I can still come through before the half. You know, I can still come through in the third quarter of today. And then maybe I end the fourth quarter feeling really good about myself. And that, you know, like you can kind of use it as like a springboard to say, all right, today didn't start off how I wanted it to, but maybe I can do more to make up for that later in the day. And then maybe that day was, you know, even more of a net positive than it would have been.
Totally. Absolutely. And I think the same kind of techniques can be used for like, you know, wanting to improve your diet or wanting to drink more water, or, you know what I mean? Like these kinds of tools can be so useful in so many other ways. But I think an all or nothing mentality, I see it a lot, honestly, because it's just this, it can be kind of this idealistic idea that we have in our mind of like, oh no, I'm going to be able to accomplish my goal 100%. And then, and that's just not realistic, right? We're human beings. We're flawed human beings. And so at some point things are going to come up and you're not going to be able to do it 100%. And that's okay. As long as you can do techniques like breaking it up into quarters and realize that you can still have a good day.
Now I'm curious. So, you know, you obviously, work with a lot of people who are dealing with some sort of mental health struggle. Do you see that there's a correlation with, let's say that they're not dealing with like something with their finances in particular, like whatever it might be in their personal life, relationships, or what have you? Do you see that could sometimes have a correlation to how they manage their finances, that they let, you know, the other important area, or even their fitness, right? They let these other important areas go because maybe what seems like a more crucial or more pressing area of their life is falling apart?
Yeah. I mean, I think if I understand your question correctly, I think what comes to my mind is managing your money well is a form of self-care. You know, like if you're managing your money well and you're saving, or, you know, you're not spending excessively and you're hitting your goals, like that's a way of taking care of yourself. So I think similar to fitness, you know, when you're exercising or when you're eating well, like that's a form of self-care. And so when you're really prioritizing self-care, then that's something that you're going to prioritize, and it's something that you're going to like make room for. But when areas in your life are kind of feeling disheveled and you aren't making room for self-care and you're not prioritizing that, then things like money and, you know, making sure that you're taking care of your health in other ways is going to go by the wayside.
I love that you call dealing with your finances self-care, because it's funny when sometimes when I'm talking with someone through like what's going on in their budget or in their finances, they're like, well, you know, I have to make room for self-care with my spending, even though I'm in deep credit card debt, or even though I don't have an emergency fund, or my finances are falling apart, or I might be evicted, you know, whatever it is. They're like, I have to make room for self-care. This is a form of like, you gotta like, and this is almost one of the more obvious form, like this and fitness, I would say, are the two most obvious forms of self-care. Cause it's like, if these don't get taken care of, everything else falls apart.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I know that when I see my clients who have struggled with money start to really get on the right track, with, you know, hitting their financial goals and saving enough and doing all of that, like I see that they feel lighter. They feel more at ease. They feel more secure, which makes so much sense, because money is and that getting that financial security is such a huge part of just feeling okay, right? Yeah. And like feeling safe and feeling secure in your housing or in your, you know, being able to put food on your table. Like those things are just fundamental needs, right? And so that's why I categorize it as self-care, because when we look at like being able to just care for yourself in the most fundamental ways, like that is self-care.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, but like I always like think of, you know, managing your money as like, you know, taking care of you're in a financial hygiene, like as if you were to brush your teeth every day. Like brushing my teeth is not my favorite activity, but I do it because I know if I don't, I'm going to get cavities and I don't want to have to go to the dentist for that. Same reason why I take care of my money, because I know that if I don't take care of my money, I'm going to end up in a bad place with it. Right. So I always tell Nick that like kind of use that same scenario there, and so I like that you call it self-care. I never really called it that before, but I think I'm going to moving forward, because you're right. It's something you need to take care of. But something you talked about was, when you're being pressured into doing something and then you just fall off for the rest of the day. I think a lot of people, have a lot of, shame and guilt when it comes to money because they can't stick to something and they just constantly feel like a failure. I see that a lot when someone really wants to get out of credit card debt and then an emergency pops up and they just, or, they want to go out with friends or whatever and they just continue to go in debt. How do people, I'm sure this is something that you deal a lot with clients, but how do people move past that, shame or guilt to actually be able to, build that self-trust within them to move forward? I guess, if they've had all this experience with failure, how do they move past that shame and guilt? Because I think that's something that comes up a lot with money.
Yeah.
That we see.
Yeah. I mean, I think the number one thing that goes through my mind is helping those people differentiate and differentiate the fact that they're struggling with money and that this is something that this is like a struggle and it is not who they are.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because I think once people adopt this mentality of, well, I'm bad with money, that's like you identifying as that. I'm just a person who's bad with money, right?
Yeah.
I just fail at managing my money, right? Like that in and of itself, you're just setting yourself up for just an uphill battle, right? Yeah. But instead, if you say something like, I'm a person who right now is trying to make, prioritize making different financial decisions. You see how that just feels so different?
Yep.
Like it feels so different just saying it that way. So I think like helping them recognize that there's a difference between a pattern of behavior of like overspending and who they are as a person. That just because they cannot manage their money does not make them a failure. It just makes them a person who is not prioritizing it right now.
Yeah.
Right. Or that they're needing more support for whatever reason. Right. And that's okay, that there's nothing wrong with needing more support. And I also think like normalizing it too is also super helpful. Like it is. And you guys know, like this is so unbelievably common for people to just struggle with managing money. And I think the temptation out there, keeping up with the Joneses, wanting cool things, like I think that makes it tough. But I also think if we're never really taught these things, like it's also kind of crazy how like in school, middle school, high school, college, like there's nowhere where you're actually taught how to manage your money. But we're just kind of expected to know how to do it. And that's not fair. You know what I mean? Like maybe we're expected to learn it from our parents, but if our parents aren't good with money, like then how are we going to learn it? Right. Or if our parents don't teach us. And so I also just think like helping people recognize and like instead just be curious about, well, what is it that's causing the problem and them being able to execute what it is that they need to execute. So instead of being judgmental of themselves, well, I'm such a failure, instead be curious and ask a question of like, why is this so difficult for me? Like, instead of being like, God, I'm so bad at this, I'm such a failure. Instead say, like, what was it that made it really difficult for me to not buy that thing that I shouldn't have bought? There was clearly something that was going on for me. Like I really needed it. I felt like I needed it. Why did I feel like I needed it? And then sometimes that exploration could mean like, oh yeah, like I was really stressed out about this one thing and I just felt like buying this thing might make me feel better. Right? Like sometimes you can get to that self-awareness or that insight. And then you kind of can then learn something about yourself. Oh, I'm a person who when I'm stressed, I tend to want to buy things. Wow. Like look at how much information you just got about yourself just by being curious and asking yourself that question. And then seeing that as data to then inform how you want to approach it differently, right? Like, okay, I know when I'm in a high stressful situation, I'm tempted even more. So what am I going to do differently moving forward when I'm really stressed? And instantly you can just see that how we talk about it feels different. It's not ridden with guilt and shame and, oh my God, I suck at this. Instead, it's like, oh, I'm just a person who struggles with this when I'm stressed. Like, that's understandable. Like, okay, so what am I going to do differently? And what kind of support do I need to set up for myself?
Yeah, I love that. And I think we talk about this a lot, but like, when you are trying to change from a place of shame and guilt, it just makes you feel even worse. Like I think about the biggest example is obviously money, but also like dieting. Like if you hate yourself and you're going to the gym, why is that it's not going to be a fun experience. You know what I mean? Like you have to like drop all of that and view it from a different lens to actually like make the changes. So yeah, I love everything you said there.
Yeah, and you had mentioned something, and I guess this kind of ties into like the accountability piece, or maybe almost even like the lack of accountability. But like when people come to the realization that they're not good at something, and let's say it's with their finances, like they're like, I'm just not good at managing my money. I know that. To me, you almost lose some of my sympathy, because it's like that second part that you were mentioning, like, all right, but what am I going to do about it? Like in my mind, when someone comes to that realization, like I am not good with money, then to me, my level of sympathy, if they've come to that realization for years, and they're like, for years, I've known I'm not good with money. My sympathy goes down, because I'm like, so what have you done about that then? Like, if you've known you've been bad with money, and the problem, this almost gets worse in my head, because I'm like, now with like things like Chat GPT, or, YouTube's been around for 20 years now, or 15 years now. It's like, you can look up almost anything and figure anything out, even if that's just a starting point to getting more information. And there's definitely not a question in here. I just side rant, I guess. But like, yeah, in my mind, it's hard when I see people not taking accountability for saying, all right, I know I suck at this thing, and I'm choosing to allow myself to continue sucking at this thing. I don't know. It's an interesting dynamic.
Well, my guess, Nick, is those are people who also probably struggle with confidence and like have low self-worth in general.
Yeah.
That's my guess. Because for people who know that they struggle with something, yet they can't quite get themselves to like take action, is usually, generally from what I see, is usually because there's like this level within them. There's this sense within them of like, oh, I'm just not maybe worthy of something better. And so I'm just going to continue to just suck at this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, so that might be there too. I mean, I definitely can't say that would be the case for everybody, but it just, I do tend to see that if we feel like we're really bad at something, chances are that there is some like negative held belief that we have about ourselves that's just influencing our behavior in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And I feel like money in particular is tied so deeply, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit, tied so deeply into your self-worth. Like, and we've said this cheesy phrase on the podcast before, but like your net worth is not your self-worth. And I feel like a lot of people do get that kind of confused, because if they feel, and I get the struggle, because if you feel like you're failing with your finances, it's hard to not feel like you are failing as a person, or as an adult, or as a parent, or the head of the household, or whatever it is. But I think it's an interesting struggle to see people who tie what's going on in their financial life so deeply into who they are as a person, and what they can do then in the future. Like you said, it ties so deeply into their level of confidence moving forward.
Yeah. And I think, if you think about it, a lot of times as children, we get praised for what we've accomplished, right? Like, oh, you did a great job at that soccer game, or, oh, you got all straight A's. Good job. Right? Like, so much of our self-worth, unfortunately, can get very tied into performance. And I think money in some ways kind of gets tied in with how well you're doing, right? Like how you're performing in your life, right? Like, are you successful in life? And so I think that when think about it, even like when you see really like well off people, right? Like people who have plenty of money. Like, what do we think? Oh, they've got their shit together. They're successful. They've got it all together. And maybe we even look at them in a certain way, right? And I think that, so I think that when we're struggling financially, I think for a lot of people, it can be deemed as like, oh, this is a huge personal failure because I'm not performing well and I'm used to being praised for my performance kind of thing, Does that make sense? So like there's just this strong tie between how well are my finances and how worthy I am, because in our society today, like how well you're doing financially can sometimes very well impact how you're treated out in the world, what you're able to go and do, what you're able to afford, And so I think that part of that is just deeply embedded in our culture.
Yeah.
And then I think it also kind of just gets wired within us at a young age of like, oh, I'm worthy based on what I can actually accomplish. And what I accomplish is based on how much I'm, how much money I make is based on how much I accomplish.
And it's interesting because there's, Lauren, you might have mentioned this a while ago about this study that talks about there's like a threshold for where you can correlate your happiness with how much you're earning. And once you surpass this threshold, and for most people, it's a little bit above once their basic needs are taken care of. If it takes you $50,000 to cover your rent, food, all your utilities and all things like that, and then a little bit more than that to be able to enjoy life somewhat, once you start earning more than that, your return on investment, so to speak, on your level of happiness starts to diminish greatly. And the way I've always thought about it is if, someone is making $300,000 and you give them an extra $50,000, they're not going to get that much happier. Their life's not going to get that much better. But if you have someone who's making $40,000, you give them that same $50,000, now their life is completely different. And it's just interesting to see that there is like a threshold there to where if you earn more than that, you have to find satisfaction in your life in other areas other than your finances, or at least what the numbers look like on paper.
Absolutely. I mean, I do think that I could have sworn that there was a study about this, but what I think the study, if I'm recalling correctly, did basically insinuate is like financial wealth isn't really what determines happiness. What actually determines happiness and content in life is like connectedness and like having a sense of community is really what like ultimately fundamentally as human beings, like what influences like our health and our happiness. And I think this actually goes in line with like a recent epidemic that got announced earlier, I think last year, of like loneliness is like now this huge epidemic in the United States, which made so much sense to me because I know just from all of my, understanding and knowledge and training that as human beings, like we need to connect with people. And so if we're not doing that and we don't have a solid sense of community, it is going to impact our happiness. And I think we're made to believe, well, the more money you have, the more happiness you're going to have. But I don't think that's necessarily true. And studies, I think, don't show that either.
Yeah. And I feel like unless you can find a way to where earning more money equates to you being able to connect with more people, or equates to you being able to do things for more people, or whatever, whatever that might look like in your life, if it's able to connect you with more people and drive more relationships your way, then yeah, I could see then earning more money then equates to more happiness. But if you're missing that part, I mean, everyone has heard of the millionaires or billionaires who are miserable, or whose lives are falling apart behind the scenes, but they're extremely successful.
Totally. Exactly. Yeah. That just because they may be a billionaire doesn't necessarily mean that they're happy.
Yeah.
No, it reminds me of when I first started my debt-free journey, many years ago. I kind of went through like this like minimalist sort of lifestyle change, and it honestly changed the entire trajectory of my life, I think.
Wow.
Their biggest, it's not about having nothing in your house. It's more about focusing on the people and experiences in your life over the things in your life, which ultimately changes your money. Because, for me, I wasn't trying to go out and, chase happiness by purchasing something. I was like, how can I surround myself with my family and my friends and just be fulfilled that way? So that really changed like my whole life. Honestly, it changed my whole life. Like that documentary I watched, and then just sort of like implementing that stuff into my life, because I wasn't focused on the money piece anymore. I was more focused on like what's right in front of me. And that is what is actual, like that, what's actually creates happiness, at least for me. And I think that's why millionaires and billionaires, whatever, aren't happy, because these things that they're buying are not providing that for them. You know what I mean? So yeah, just side note there, but.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense to me, because essentially what you did is you focus your energy on what brings like your life purpose and meaning. Yeah. Right. And I think when we focus on that, we are going to feel just inherently more satisfied.
All right, taking a quick break from today's episode, Lauren and I have some exciting news we'd like to share with you. If you're feeling stuck with your finances and don't know where to start, we have you covered with our one-on-one financial coaching.
These are no strings attached coaching sessions that you can sign up for today. No ongoing commitment. You simply book a session whenever you need one.
Each call is 90 minutes, and by the end of it, you'll have a clear budget to work with and a solid plan to start paying off your debt. Plus, we'll make sure you walk away with some awesome tools to keep you on track, including our budget dashboard and expense tracker, as well as our debt payoff optimizer.
And the best part, you'll get to work with both of us on the call. Together, we'll help you develop the best possible strategy forward, answer your questions, and make sure you feel confident about managing your money.
So if you're ready to get a handle on your budget and kickstart your financial journey forward, check out the link in the show notes to book your first session.
We can't wait to get started with you. Now, back to the episode.
Okay, so switching gears a little bit, and we did kind of talk about this earlier in this episode, but money and relationships, like that is such a hot topic. And and a lot, and we've all heard the statistic, right? Like of the marriages that end in divorce, like 50% of them are because of money fights or money issues. And I feel like a lot of it comes down to really two things in particular. One is just, of course, the lack of communication, but then I think a bigger issue there is a lack of shared values when it comes to money. Shereen, is that something you've noticed, like when you work with couples in therapy sessions, that if there's a lack of communication around the money or a lack of shared values?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think when it comes to relationships, I think money, I think conversations about money are just inherently emotionally loaded, because money represents a lot of things. It represents like security, freedom, control, trust, and even love. And so when couples talk about money, like they're really talking about values and their fears and or unmet needs, And so I think that if couples are just looking at it like face value of like we're just talking about money, but they're struggling with these conversations, then I think that's when they have to take a step back and really look at like, oh, okay, what is really like beneath the surface here? What are we really talking about between the lines? Because when money gets talked about within a relationship, it's a conflict. It's rarely just about the money.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems that, when couples are having issues with the money, like most of the time it's like you said, because they aren't having shared values around how to deal with the money. And, we always tend to say like it doesn't necessarily matter, and there's a caveat there, of course, but it doesn't necessarily matter where you two are at financially. And that can be a hard pill to swallow for some people who have, done a lot to get ahead in their finances. But what matters more is are you two actually aligned in how you look at money? Because two people who are, let's say you're looking at two different couples, then they're both on wildly different bases with their finances than their partner. The couple who at least share the values, like, hey, one person might be really well off, the other person might be in debt, but they're like, no, I'm working towards getting out of this debt. It was from a part of me that, I want to get rid of, or a past life that I'm trying to move on from. Those two people are going to have so much more success than, say, another couple where they're both well off, but they look at money, they handle money, they do things with money differently. Like, have you noticed that?
Yes, absolutely. And what I've also really seen is it actually, I mean, the differences around money, it isn't always necessarily about how they're approaching money so differently, but what I see is how they're communicating to one another about the money. Like what tends to happen if one person has a very different view about money than the other is then what I've seen when there is a lot of conflict is one is really judgmental of the other, and then the other gets really defensive, and then the other, gets really hurt by that and starts avoiding having these conversations.
Yeah.
And we know that avoidance doesn't lead to anything good. And then, so there's this back and forth push and pull conflict that at the end of the day, it actually is no longer about the money. It's about how they're not feeling heard. They're not respecting one another. They're not acknowledging that they have different views and then coming together and saying, okay, as a couple, how can we address these different views that we have? That's a very different conversation when two calm people are coming together saying, okay, I hear that you have this view. I have this one. How are we going to come together and try to make this work? Very different than being accusatory, being blaming the other. And that usually is what happens because money is a very hot emotional topic. And so the ways that people respond to those conversations, I think generally the way that they respond and communicate in those conversations is generally the biggest reason why sometimes those conversations go downhill.
Yeah. You're going to say something, Laura?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I think probably what you could also trace this back to is how their parents communicated about money or didn't communicate about money. Did it create, when your parents talked about money, was it like super stressful and everybody just went to bed, nobody talked? Because then obviously when you're talking to your partner about it, you're going to obviously want to shy away from it because you know what that did to your parents. You know what I mean? Or, if someone, or then like maybe someone in the relationship is more of like managing the money and you just sort of feel like the child in the relationship. You know what I mean? So I think there's so many, I find this super fascinating to like trace all of that back and then how it comes into our current relationships. And then how do we change that moving forward? I think that's one of the biggest questions I have is like, yeah, that's ingrained in us for our entire childhood and, adolescence. And then it's like, And then we're supposed to be in a relationship together and combine finances and it just all be okay. So I don't know, there's a much
Yeah.
bigger topic and probably a whole other episode to this, but you know, that's just something that comes to mind whenever I think about couples and how they handle their money together.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it goes even beyond to how they handle their money together, and it's more about how are they handling conflicts together.
Yeah.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because if you know that, say, you're coming in really defensive, but you in this relationship are open to, say, being gently called out, you know, like say your partner said, "Hey, you're being a little defensive. Are you aware of that?" And you're actually open to that and say, "Yeah, I am actually being a little defensive." And you're interested in being introspective and like be curious about, okay, why am I getting defensive? Why am I responding in this way? I don't want to respond in this way. I want to, you know, and actually be very open in in the conversation with your partner about wanting to make changes or wanting to get on the same page with each other instead of attacking one another. That makes a huge difference, right? Because the reality is with a couple, you're always going to have something that you're disagreeing about. Like there's always just with most couples, there's usually at least one or two ongoing conflicts in a relationship that will just never get solved. And right, that's just the reality. And sometimes, I mean, you're lucky if it's just one or two. And so, and so it ends up not really coming, it's not about coming to a resolution in those conflicts. It's actually more about how are we going to coexist as a team with these conflicts so that the both of us can still feel like we're being heard and understood, you know, in the context of, say, the money conversations. And so that's where I think things get really lost is like, you know, yes, shared values is important. Like, do we want to save for X? How do we want our retirement to look like? How do we want to raise our children, private school, public? Like those conversations are really important, right? But I think how the conversations are being had, I think will really determine the success and whether or not they'll actually figure stuff out. Because it actually speaks to a lot deeper issues if there are there within the relationship.
Yeah. At what point should or would someone draw the line if say them and their spouse are not on the same page with money? Like, because there's, you know, of course, in a relationship, there's compromise and then there's standing your ground on what you think you feel is right. Like, where do people kind of draw that line if they feel like they're not in alignment with, and I guess, of course, it's going to be different if you are dating someone versus if you're married to someone. But where do people, like, how do they determine where they draw the line between misaligned values on money?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a good reason why it's just paramount to talk about this kind of stuff before getting married, right? To make sure that the really big stuff you guys are on the same page with, right? You know, like if you have one partner who is not interested in investing in retirement at all, yet you have another one who's like, absolutely, we have to. And you just, there's no room there's no wiggle room. There's no compromise on that. You know, or like one person says like, I have to, you know, our kids have to go to the most expensive private schools. And the other person's like, absolutely not. You know, like those kinds of things have to be talked about ahead of time. And in terms of where you draw the line, I mean, I think obviously when you're on opposite ends of the spectrum and there's no room for compromise, like either one are not willing to compromise, then I think that does just bring up the question of, well, are we a good match? You know, are we a good match to be lifelong partners if we do view things very differently in that way, or if we value things differently? But this happens a lot, right? Like where you have one really frugal person and then you have another person who's a big spender, you know, and I think like mutual consideration is key, you know, like, okay, you could be a big spender, but if you know that actually is something that your partner gets really upset with, you keep doing it. That's a lack of consideration of your partner, right? And then that actually can create a whole other issue, right? It ends up actually not really being totally a money issue. It's actually, well, you know that this is something that's upsetting to me, yet you're still doing it. And that partner who's frugal is not going to feel good about that, right? Like that may be like, well, I feel like you're not really showing me love and consideration by continuing to spend excessively, right? So like it gets complicated a little bit there, you know, how that's why I think money is just such an emotionally heavy topic for couples. And it's just so key to, sorry, can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. It was funny you mentioned that. Oh, did you cut out?
Hold on. Okay, you guys there?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. Okay, sorry. Siri got involved and I don't know why.
Are you good? Are you all good now?
I'm good. Siri just kind of popped up and I don't know why. So sorry about that.
That's okay.
What's happening right now? Yes.
I was going to mention is funny that you mentioned like, you know, if one person's more of a saver, one person's more of a spender, like I feel like I see that in so many other relationships as well, but also in my own, like my wife is definitely more of the saver. I am much more of the spender. And you know, we started dating when we were 18. And so, earlier on in our relationship as two young adults, it was like, that was a big point of conflict. But over time, like, I think we've both kind of slid a little bit closer to the middle to where now, like, I have a deep appreciation for being a saver, even though I know, like, at heart, if I can justify spending money, I will go all out on spending money because I love to do that. Whereas on the flip side, like, I can see when my wife does give in to spending money, like, she recognizes the value of actually enjoying it, you know, like enjoying it. And, you know, I would say I'm still more of the spender. She's still more of the saver, but finding that room to say like, all right, both of those traits are valuable. There's just a time and a place for each of them.
Absolutely. I think that's a great example of how you can have two people in a relationship who are on opposite ends of the spectrum, but still kind of find a way to make it work and gradually kind of find the benefits of being one way or the other. You know, and because I think it ends up being a really good balance, right? Think about if you have a couple who you guys are both heavy spenders, that's tough.
Yeah.
You know, because there's no one in the relationship to kind of reel it in a little bit, you know? Yeah.
I mean, my favorite quote about like relationships and couples is if you two were exactly the same, one of you would be unnecessary, you know? So I think it's kind of good for people to be a little different from each other. So long as those differences aren't, detrimental to like the health of the relationship or the health of the finances, the health of your actual like mental health or physical health or things like that. I think when two people are different enough, it's good because then you two can kind of grow together and learn together, and start to appreciate those differences for what they are, as opposed to if you two are exactly alike. It could be great if you two are exactly alike in all the positive ways versus if you two are exactly alike in all the negative ways. Like you said, like if you're both big spenders,
right,
that's going to go downhill quick.
Yeah. If you're not making enough money to finance that kind of lifestyle, yeah, it's going to get tough.
Now, you had mentioned that money should be something that a couple talks about when they are deciding if they want to spend their lives with each other. At what, like how, I guess at what point in a young relationship does that come up? And then how can someone go about bringing that up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I really feel like at the point where, you know, you guys are serious in a relationship and you know that you both are considering one another for marriage or just a lifelong partnership. I feel like, you know, that's I mean, it's been a while for me, but there, you know, there's just an understanding, kind of a mutual, there's a mutual understanding of like, okay, if we're both thinking that we're going to live, you know, our lives together, we need to be on the same page about some pretty important things.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel like that's kind of just having like an adult relationship, having an adult conversation about future, you know, oriented topics. Right. And so I feel like every relationship, when they're making that choice or when they're about to make that choice, these are conversations that should be had, that shouldn't be avoided. I think once you do get to that point in a relationship where it's feeling like serious and you both know you're on the same page about a long-term partnership, I feel like at that point it's pretty safe to say that's a good time to bring it up. Because I think bringing it up sooner rather than later is better, because then you can start to see like, okay, are there landmines here that we need to prepare for? You know, because sometimes even just that first time you bring it up, you can like instantly see the person being like, oh, we'll be fine. I don't want to talk about it. You know, like that's a potential landmine. Right. And so I think what I often see is that couples tend to put off these really serious conversations way longer than they should. Yeah. And then they're like, right, you know, they got engaged already and they're about to get married. And then they realize they're like really different on super, super important things. And it boggles my mind. Like, how on earth did you guys go this long and this far in the relationship without making sure that you're on the same page about certain things? So I'm a big proponent of like, have the conversation and, you know, and don't avoid it, because I think it ends up becoming potentially a big problem later down the road.
What would you say are the important areas of life where or conversations that couples need to have, and areas of life where there needs to be alignment, even if that's not total agreement. Money obviously being one of them. What are the other areas you'd see that a successful couple aligns on?
Yeah, I mean, money is definitely one. I think spirituality, I think really just having a good understanding of like, are we on the same page with spirituality? And if not, how is that going to impact our relationship? If we have kids, is that going to impact how we want to raise our children? I think that's a really important one. Child rearing is a super, super important one. Are we going to be 50-50 parents, or is the expectation 70-30? Like, I think that's a really good conversation to have beforehand. I even think like just even professionally, like, okay, are we both going to be working, whether there are kids or not? Like, are we both going to plan on working throughout our partnership, or are you hoping to kind of take a back seat and maybe work part-time? Like I think those kinds of conversations are really important. Yeah, I mean, those are probably the main ones that are top of mind. Those feel like the biggest ones that, when they don't take place, I just see red flags.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's, I guess, I feel like, and this is maybe a weird way to ask it, but I feel like those levels or those areas of life naturally, like, I feel like people tend to rank things in their head. Like, some of these items may be more important or less important. Do you feel like there's a level of which, like, all right, we can kind of disagree on some of these things, but we need to agree on more of them than not?
Yeah, I think it also depends on the level of disagreement. You know what I mean? Like, if they're
Yeah.
on opposite ends of the spectrum versus a little bit like disagree, but they're like kind of still in the middle, like kind of to now where you and your wife is. You know what I mean? Like, you guys are
Yeah.
still not exactly of the same, but I think that really depends. I think also having the discussion of like, okay, this is something we disagree on. Is that something we're okay with, assuming this doesn't change throughout our
Mm.
relationship? Right? Like, I think sometimes also people want to trick themselves into thinking, well, we don't agree with this now, but after we get married, it's going to be different. You know what I mean? Like, we want to believe that like things are going to go our way once the ring is on the finger. And no, like, that doesn't,
Yeah.
I say don't bank on that. Maybe that would happen, but don't bank on that. And so even the things that you don't agree on, like, just be sure that you are cool with, if this never changes, I'm going to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And I think like you also kind of have to have this process within yourself of like, okay, what are my non-negotiables?
Yeah.
Right? Like, if my partner doesn't agree with me on this, am I okay with that? And I think you have to know yourself fairly well to know what those non-negotiables are. So you just have to make sure that you're also kind of doing your own work and figuring that out.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. All right. Well, I know we've covered a lot of serious topics today, so maybe to I guess switch gears a little bit into something a little more lighthearted. We thought it'd be fun to play a game of red flag, green flag. And so Lauren and I were going to read you 7 different scenarios that are all kind of related to mental health, finances, relationships, and we'd love to get your take on them. So if you can say whether you think it's a red flag, a green flag, and then why. Lauren, do you want to read off the first one?
Yeah, sure. I choose to keep the peace with my partner by avoiding topics with money because it always leads to arguments.
Ooh, red flag. Red flag. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's probably an obvious one, right? Like, kicking it down the line, kicking that can down, whatever that expression is, which, by the way, I've never used that expression except today. But it just feels very appropriate, right? Like, just continuing to avoid is not the solution. So that's a big red flag, because it's not going to go away by not talking about it. And oftentimes not talking about it just ends up making things worse.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The next one says, I splurge on shopping as a way to deal with my stress, but I always stay within budget.
This I would say green-ish. Because if they're setting a budget for their stress habits, they're saying, okay, like, I know I like to spend when I get stressed, and I'm going to allot myself this much money for my stress spending. And they stick with that. I'd say green.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next one says we're pausing our debt payoff journey to save up as much money as possible because we just found out we're having a baby.
Yeah, I think that's agreed. I'm down with that. Yeah, like it's because there's a mutual agreement of like we're gonna save for this shared goal of like we're having a baby. Yeah, I like it. Green.
Yeah. The next one says, I always make it a point to send money to my family who struggles financially, even though it impacts my quality of life.
Ooh, I mean, I love the generosity, but long term, that's tough. I want to say yellow flag. Can we throw out the option of a yellow flag?
Yeah, we can.
A beige flag. There we go. Kind of in
A
between.
beige flag, yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one because, you know, where it goes through my mind is like, okay, is it possible for you to send less so that it doesn't impact your quality of life as much? You know, if you see that it's going to continue to impact your quality of life and maybe worsen, and it's going to get worse down the line, you know, again, money and having good finances is good self-care, right? So when you're not doing that, even if it's for something really generous like that, it's still not great.
Yeah, for sure. The next one says, I avoid spending money. Whoops, sorry. I avoid spending money frivolously because it stresses me out, even though I know I can afford it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky one. I love these ones, by the way, guys, because it's like not like super red or
Yeah.
green. This is a good one because I kind of also want to say a little middle one because even though they can afford it, the fact that it's stressing her out, I don't love that for her. You know,
Yeah.
like I'm assuming it's a she. I don't know if you said that. Um, I don't love that for her, and so I feel like she could probably work on like some um you know, like ways that she's thinking about money that's impacting how she feels when she spends, right? Because if you have the money, you feel, you know, good about what you're buying. You're not like having, you know, buyer's remorse. I
Yeah.
don't like that it's bringing up stress for her. So I feel like that's probably worth looking into for her.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
And then just two more here. This one says, I feel like I need to hit a certain financial milestone to feel worthy or successful, but I'm working towards it steadily so I can still enjoy life.
Red flag, red flag, red flag. Anytime we're trying to reach a goal to then feel worthy is like a big red flag, right? Because self-worth comes internally, does not come from external stuff. And so,
Yeah.
you know, I'd say that person needs to maybe go to therapy or work on themselves to get their self-worth, you know, because and this is a really important thing because people just feel like, and they don't realize that self-worth comes internally. Like we are all inherently worthy. And I think that when that message doesn't get sent to a person, they instantly think that they need to achieve something to feel worthy. And that's a big no-no.
Yeah, I love that. And then the last one here says, my partner and I are always transparent about finances, except when it comes to birthday and holiday gifts for each other.
I think as long as they're okay with that, you know, if it's like a mutual agreement, and they're done not having problems with how much they're spending on each other, green flag all the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe if they're not buying like a car for
Yeah,
a person.
that's the first thing that
Get
came to
more.
mind.
Yeah, well,
sign
that's
of
the
that
thing. I feel like they may need to set like a budget. Like, okay, we don't want to, as long as it doesn't go over however much money, then go crazy, like go ham. But if it's like a big purchase, anything over a set amount, like they need to have a discussion about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Doing that, like, yeah.
Nice.
That was
Well,
fun.
Shereen, that was all the questions and scenarios we had for you. And so thank you so much for being on the show today. If people want to get connected with you, whether to say hi, we saw you on the podcast, or to talk to you about, you know, what sort of mental health services you offer, what's the best way that they can do that?
Yeah, they can contact me through our website, which is relucentpg.com. That's spelled RELUCENT, pg.com. There's like a contact form on there and a phone number, so they can just send in a message through that if they have a specific question for me or any questions about our services. They are more than welcome to reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely link that down below. And as always, you know, if you found some value from today's episode, the best way you can help us grow is by considering to subscribe and sharing this with a friend.
Yeah, and if you want to have your money question answered on the show, you can visit our website, justanothermoneypodcast.com, and click the submit a question button. And don't forget to join us for the next episode of Just Another Money Podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations provided on this podcast are for entertainment purposes only and do not constitute professional financial advice. Any financial decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are your responsibility. We strongly recommend consulting with a licensed financial advisor or other qualified professional before making any significant financial decisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that we are not liable for any financial outcomes.